everyone, and welcome to A Girl, a Guy, and a Buffy podcast. I'm one of your hosts. I'm Charles Swint.
And I'm your other host, Kate Balzer.
And we are two friends here who have been watching Buffy since the beginning, and we are not a rewatch podcast. We explore the big bad themes of the show, and this is a podcast full of spoilery goodness. So if you have not watched the entire series and don't want to be spoiled, press pause now.
Hey everyone, we're super excited for today's show. So welcome. We have a very special episode for you today. We have a bonus episode. If you've been listening to this season, you know that we've been discussing romantic relationships in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, specifically focusing on Willow, Xander, Spike, and Buffy. And so what we wanted to do to wrap this half of this season up is bring in an expert on relationships, mental health, counseling, who also happens to be a massive Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan. Yay!
Yes.
That was like equally important, equal parts.
We found one.
I know. I'm sure there are a lot out there, but we're very excited who our guest is today.
Yes.
So I want to introduce to you Jenna Gould, who is a therapist and licensed clinical social worker. So welcome, Jenna.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here talking about Buffy with you today.
Yes, we're super excited to have you. We love having these conversations with our special guests. So I know this is going to be a really good one. So give us and our listeners a little bit of information about your background and training.
Sure. So I am a licensed social worker, as you mentioned, and my degree is a master's in social work. I currently am in private practice. I work with another therapist at a practice called Clarity Counseling Atlanta. And I primarily work with adults. I work extensively with queer communities. I do a lot of work around relationships and how we show up differently depending on the relationship through an attachment context. And I really love what I do. It's different every day.
So Jenna, how did you come to Buffy? Or did you come to Buffy? Did Buffy come to you?
Yeah. So back in the days when you would just flip channels to see what was on, my sister, she's about 3 years younger. So after school, we'd always just kind of see what was on. And we both found it in syndication on FX. And I think I was like 12 or 13. So it had already been airing for probably 4 or 5 seasons by the time that I found it in reruns. And I don't remember a whole lot about the specifics, but I just remember I fell deeply in love with it, as did my sister. And it was something that we shared. And I've always loved fantasy. I've always loved a really good story to escape into. And I think even though I was a little bit young to realize I think the sexiness of the whole world really drew me in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, like those times of FX, because I do remember like the days of FX, Buffy and Angel, like when they had nothing else going on.
Yes.
It was literally like Buffy, Angel, Law and Order. Like it was
Right.
something weird like that. Like it was
It's true.
We don't have programming, so we're just gonna run all of this.
Yeah, and it was on every day. So we very quickly caught up on all the seasons that had aired, and were then able to start watching it in real time. It didn't take long. It was on every single day after school. It was like, I don't even know if it was 1 episode or 2 episodes a day, but powered through really fast.
Yeah. I think I remember being like 2 episodes back to back. I think they would air them in the morning because I feel like I remember. So this is going to show our age difference. I remember being like getting up for work and getting ready and like throwing it on while I was like eating breakfast. And so it'd be
Yeah.
like 6 and 7, and then I think they would do it again like in the afternoon. But yeah, and then you'd have Angel, you'd have the X-Files. I mean, I've definitely come to new shows thanks to like reruns and syndication on cable.
Yeah. So if it was on in the morning, we may have even been TiVoing it.
Yeah.
Back when TiVo was a thing.
Right. It was like
Yeah.
exactly.
That iconic sound.
Well, that's awesome. I know. I feel like it's a common trend among Buffy fans about what draws us in. I think in the end, when you hear fans talk about their experience, it all, kind of starts to sound similar because there just was something so magnetic about the show, particularly at that time. It was breaking, especially if you're watching it in real time, even a few years later, it's still on the air, but also in reruns, that it was doing things that you really hadn't seen before on so many TV shows, particularly like for teens. So anyone in their teens and 20s, it was, really appealing in a new way.
So Jenna, can I ask you, this is a totally like off the cuff question. Was there like when you remember thinking back watching it, was there a character that you sort of instantly connected with and were like, this is the person?
I mean, I was really captivated by Sarah Michelle Gellar, and she's so magnetic, and I think she really drew me in. I think I most related to Willow because I was a nerd. I was very smart. I was very shy. So I think I related most to her, but also just the relationships on the show itself and the friendships, which are such an important part of the show. Um, it all drew me in. Hindsight is 2020. I'm queer, and at the time, that wasn't even like within my vocabulary. But I think it is a very queer show, and there's a moment in Becoming, I can't remember if it's part 1 or part 2, when Buffy comes out to Joyce as a Slayer, and it really parallels a coming out story. And I think that resonated with me on a deep level, even though I didn't know it at the time.
Okay, so here's the most important question we're going to ask you this whole time. Are you Team Angel, Team Spike, or Team Cookie Dough? Or really, other team we did not name. It doesn't have to be all about Buffy.
So I was very much, when I first started watching it, it was very much Team Angel. I was an Angel girl. I just loved how romantic that relationship is. The being fated, that storyline. As an adult watching it back, there's really not much to their relationship. Like it's founded on this connection, which Sarah Michelle Gellar and David Boreanaz absolutely sell. But I think at the time when I was watching it, that storyline, just the romance of it all, really captivated me. But I also really, I love Spike as a character, and I think Buffy and Spike is very interesting and makes for really good dark storytelling. I think as a therapist, I would have to say Team Cookie Dough, that everyone needs to go to a lot of therapy and sort out their own shit before they're really ready for a serious relationship.
Your answer literally just summarized Charles and I's discussion of Buffy's relationships in our 2-parter episode on Buffy. I'm not kidding. It's like literally point
everything.
for point.
It is. It's like, I feel like we were gaslit into believing that Buffy and Angel are like this great love story. And I'm like,
Yes.
But it's not true. You all, this is a lie. This is a bill of goods that were being sold that I don't want to buy.
It is, and I also think it was very much in fitting with the time that it was on. That was the romantic story people wanted to watch.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. There's like it's like a house built, what's that saying? A house of cards. It's like there's not a foundation there aside from the fact that like he's actually been creepily watching her from afar. So basically stalking her.
Oh my God, this is like literally our conversation.
Don't worry, 16-year-old. I've just been stalking you for a couple of years before you knew about anything about it. And then I've been negging you into liking me. And then I'm going to mess with your head. And then I'm going to break up with you. And, it's a trauma-bonded relationship. That's really great.
Yeah, ask me why my expectations of romantic relationships as a young adult were getting messed up.
This is what we got. This is what we were given.
Yeah,
exactly.
That being said, even when I watch it back, though, I get swept up. Like those feelings. I mean, it's everything. And I mean, the score also is fantastic.
Yeah.
I love the music. I actually had a film professor in college who had like written scholarly articles on the music in Buffy, which I thought was very cool, but I was too afraid to talk to him about at the time. So it just like it really pulls on the heartstrings. But when you pull it apart, it's I think everything that Charles just said.
Yeah.
Well, and it's one of those things too, like at 16, so like all your feelings are so big, everything is so important. And so when you like throw in the responsibility of like literally having to save the world, coupled with this, big romance, of course it feels like it's the most important thing that you will ever have, because you are also doing the most important thing that you will ever do at the same time that you've fallen in love. So why like conflating those two things absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, it does. You're right. Like these are not brains that are finished developing. It is, I mean, the emotions are just running really big at that age. What's really interesting is, I mean, for obvious reasons, Buffy is very much an authority figure and takes on being a parent too later in the series. But even before then, it's some of the patterns that I really like working with in therapy are with folks who have grown up with emotionally immature parents. So they end up doing a lot of the parenting and caretaking. And I see that play out in Buffy just because she has the fucking world on her shoulders.
Yeah.
So I think the sense of age we have is really skewed, which was very common for series at this time period. And you also have a bunch of 20-year-olds, playing 16, which again, typical. But I think that all plays into Buffy was never able to be a kid. And so her relationships also take on this like really high stakes sort of nature because she doesn't have a chance to be a regular teenager and to hold hands with a boy on the bleachers and, like just do normal things. And I think developmentally, that's really interesting.
That's such a great point. Like, that she doesn't get that. And so when we see Dawn and we get to see Dawn as a kid growing up, I think like that sort of the knee-jerk reaction was like, why is so Dawn immature? And she's so, blah, blah, blah. And people get on Dawn about it. But like Dawn is actually in some ways getting to enjoy her childhood. And I think I think audience members resent Dawn for that. And that's where that resentment comes from, because, she was the same age as Buffy when she comes on, and so it feels a little weird. So, Jenna, from a mental health perspective, how do you view the romantic relationships on the show?
I think overall they're not great.
Fair. Completely fair.
Can we use this as a pull quote?
Right.
Licensed therapist officially says
Right.
not great.
Relationships not great.
I would love that, actually. I'll add it
on a
to my resume. Yeah,
I
I
that
think
on a coffee mug right now. How was the relationships? Not great.
I know that you talked a bit about this in your episode about Willow, that her relationship with Oz actually is probably the healthiest that's shown on the show.
Mhm.
Aside from maybe Giles and Olivia, who I'm obsessed with and I want to know their whole story.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, yeah, they're not healthy. I think a lot of it feels very high stakes for obvious reasons. And no, people aren't talking to each other. That's the biggest thing. Communication is so, so important. And I say this to my clients all the time. You can't know what's going through another person's head. We can only know our own experience, and we can only try to share our inner experience with others. People will never fully be able to know and understand that. The only one who can know that is us. And we do need to try to communicate things and talk about what's going on in our heads, and also talk about our feelings. I mean, it sounds easy, and it isn't always, because we all have our own stuff. We all have our own baggage and formative relationships that impact our ability to do just that. But so much of I think, see this on TV a lot. Good storytelling does not mean necessarily healthy relationships.
Yeah.
And especially like in the 90s and early aughts, all the drama was often these complicated and up and down relationships. And I think that's also true of Buffy. I'm also thinking about like Cordelia and Xander, which they're not very nice to each other.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I think the actors do a good job of selling it. And I think the storytelling is always good on Buffy, but there's kindness missing there. And I think we do see that a lot in the relationship with Willow and Oz, and Willow and Tara. That sort of all goes out the window in season 6 when we try to use magic as an addiction storyline, which doesn't work super well, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's how I've always felt about that storyline too.
Yeah.
It's clumsy. Like,
yes,
I think there was a way to do it well, and it was just, it was clumsy.
Agreed.
Jenna, you saying that makes me wonder, like, how much of like our real lives, since so much of us are sort of inundated with watching television and these stories and all of that stuff, and we get a lot of our inspiration and a lot of our understanding of how to communicate with each other through television, whether we like to admit it or not, but I think it's true. I wonder how much of the stuff that happens on television sort of informs our poor relationship. Like how much of like what we see on television do we actually mimic in our real lives without actually knowing that that's what we're doing? Creating drama in our lives, creating like not communicating with our partners and all of this other stuff. Because if it's not drama, it's not sexy. If we're not doing this, why can't he read my mind? Why can't he like all of this stuff that we create in our head? How much of that is coming from what we've been sort of conditioned to see from watching like Dawson's Creek on WB, or all of that stuff where we're like, that's the romance that I want, and Vampire Diaries and all of that stuff. I don't know if there's an answer to that. That's a thought that just came up
Yeah,
when you were saying that.
I love that question. I think it influences us a lot, like whether people recognize it or not. I've always loved pop culture, and I've always loved TV. And just speaking from personal experience, it very much informed my expectations of how I was supposed to talk to people, and how relationships were supposed to work. I remember I had a conversation with my own therapist. I was talking about a friend who I liked more than a friend, but I was saying something along the lines of, if something happens, I want it to happen organically. And she was like, what does that even mean? Do you expect, like, if you don't say anything, do you expect something to just naturally happen? And I think her point, which I took to heart, is that we have to communicate our needs and our desires, because if we don't, how are people supposed to know? Like you said, we actually can't read each other's minds. I don't even know if I would want to, if that we saw what happened to Buffy.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a real dark place up here. No one wants to go here.
Yeah.
Not without adult supervision, at least. Like, it's just not.
Yeah. That's such a great question, Charles.
I don't know if there's an answer to it, but you made me think about that. I was like, wow, we go through so much of that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't speak for everyone, but I know it has definitely influenced me, especially in that transition from, like adolescent to adulthood. Is just such a hard time in general. And there was a lot of parsing out for me, figuring out like, oh, wait, this doesn't work like it does in TV, or in books, or in romantic comedies, because we're so inundated with that just day to day, and maybe even more so now. I don't know. I mean, I'm glad that I grew up at a time where the internet was like, you had to dial up to get on.
Yeah, exactly.
We had to be more thoughtful about.
Yeah, we say that all the time. We're super glad we did not grow up during the social media age.
Oh, yeah.
God, that would have been rough.
Yeah.
It would have been, and it just shapes your mind so much.
Yeah, so it really does. That's a good point. So one of the things I kind of am interested in, and kind of understanding more, and I think, can definitely apply to this show and the characters and how people see the characters and their relationships, is, in our society, in American society specifically, we have this like pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. But the more we learn about mental health and trauma and the impact on people, particularly younger people with developing brains, like where is the line between providing support and understanding and holding holding people accountable for their actions? For example, from the show, there's a lot of criticism of Xander and his behavior. How the show hints and then shows us at his wedding episode that he experienced multiple adverse childhood experiences. He has an alcoholic father who's verbally abusive to his mother. There's parental neglect, emotional neglect. So how much is Xander or anyone who has adverse experiences responsible for their actions, if they aren't shown anything healthier?
I really appreciate that you are trying to tease out a lot of nuance in these characters and in this universe. I think, well, what we know about trauma has come a really long way over the past, even the past 10 years. So the knowledge that we have now about the impacts of trauma on development and on developing brains, we didn't necessarily have when this universe was created. And in that one episode you're talking about, the wedding episode, I feel like we were finally given a really crucial part of Xander's story that had just been missing for so long.
Yeah.
And I wish that it had been that we had known more about that from the beginning. Because then I think we would be working with a full picture of like how responsible is Xander for the things that he does and his actions, knowing that he did experience abuse and neglect as a kid and as a teen.
Yeah.
So I think, like I said a little bit earlier, it does help us understand a lot more, and it doesn't excuse people from doing really hurtful and harmful things to others.
Yeah.
And I think Xander's certainly guilty of that. I think one of my main issues with Xander is knowing that he's a stand-in for Joss.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard for me personally to untangle that.
Yeah.
Because we know this is something that Joss always does. He always writes himself into the story.
Right.
And I don't think there's not an easy answer. How do you reconcile like this incredible universe and show that was created, and also Joss as a person, and the really harmful things that he's done.
Yeah. It's interesting. I like we were discussing with our perspective on the Buffy Angel relationship and how that changed, as the years have gone on, and we all have different perspectives on, healthy relationships and teen relationships. It's sort of the same for me with Xander. The more I've learned, the little bit I've understood about our growing knowledge about mental health and the impact of trauma, particularly on young brains. When I rewatched the series before we started this podcast, because it had been a while, I sort of was two ways on Xander. I do feel like I had a lot more empathy for him, knowing that. It didn't mean it excused his behavior, but I think I definitely, as an adult, had a bigger place of understanding. But at the same time, it is weird to watch him and know that much of how he's written comes out of Joss's own personality. And now that we know the accusations that have come out against him for his behavior, you can't see Xander the same way.
Yeah.
It's this weird, it is this weird dichotomy of trying to make those sense of those things in your head when you're watching him.
Yeah, that's the really hard thing about finding out that the creators of things that you love, or musicians or actors, are not nice people.
Yeah.
To say the least. That it is hard to untangle that. And I mean, nothing will take away my love for this show and for the characters. And whenever I criticize the show, it's from a place of love and appreciation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But it kind of makes me wonder, how would I see it now as an adult if the Joss piece was taken out of it? And I mean, I can't know that, because Nicholas Brendan does a lot of really good things with the character.
It's an interesting point that you make too, Kate. Like that, the whole idea, like since this is a character that was written with like the showrunner inserting himself into that. And I think to your point, Kate, of asking like, at what point does the character Xander, like, at what point in the growth and relationship of this character does that character start to take responsibility for their bad behavior? And if that person is a stand-in for someone whose bad behavior continues, that person can never take responsibility because the person who created them has not taken responsibility for their bad behavior. And so Xander is doomed to fail and never be that person because the person who created him is. So if someone else were to step in at some point, then maybe Xander would see the error of his ways and change, but he can't because the person he's standing in for is like continuing to like has not at that point, and to this day I guess still really hasn't taken responsibility for any of those actions.
That's a really, really good point, Charles.
That just can't, I mean, you like Kate, you saying that really like made that clear to me. I was like, oh, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So thank you for getting me there because
well, and Jenna, I don't know if you read the interview with Joss Whedon that he finally did, months after all these accusations coming out. I believe it was in the New Yorker. But I read that and it just exacerbates the situation and how you interpret particularly Xander's character when you read his what he says in that interview, because he does reveal some things about his own life and childhood that you're like, oh, that makes Xander even clearer. Like you can't help but even more make the association of how much it feels like Joss is in that character.
I know what interview you're talking about, and it is the piece that's missing is accepting responsibility for what he has done.
Yes.
Things are not mutually exclusive. Like we can hold multiple truths at the same time.
Right.
That he had a really hard and shitty childhood, and you can still accept responsibility for hurting the people that you have as an adult.
Yeah, it's true. But I think it's like, for some reason, it just seems it's one of the hardest things for people to do is hold those multiple opposing truths.
Yeah. It is. We call it a dialectic. It's that's what this whole type of therapy, DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy, is built around. That there's not just one singular truth. And while I don't use a lot of DBT in my own work, that I think is one of the most powerful things to take away from it. That your truth does not mean my truth. Your truth and my truth can exist together.
Right.
It does seem really hard for people to wrap their heads around, that we can both actually be right because our experience shapes the way we see things.
Agreed. I think that's one of the things that's probably feels like nowadays in American society is where some of the clash is happening, is that there are multiple truths and multiple perspectives that are true that can exist at the same time. But I don't know if it's cultural, I don't know if it's just human nature, but that clash of that concept is, I think, part of the conflict happening right now.
Yeah, I think you're right. We don't know how to engage in dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
From these different perspectives. And I think that social media definitely has shaped, has changed our ability to do that, because again, like, it's hard to get at nuance when you're leaving a one sentence comment or yelling at each other from behind a screen.
Right. You have that distance. And early on you had the anonymity. There's less of that now, depending on how you set up your accounts, but you definitely have that distance that you don't have to think of the other person or people on the end of at the other side of things as real, because it's just images on a screen.
And then you kind of find yourself in an echo chamber
Mm-hmm.
of just like people sort of spewing back whatever thing that you thought might be true, and people are just echoing that back to you, and it's like, well, this must be true. I see all these other, you know, talking heads saying the same thing, so it has to be true. Like, so yeah, it does get a little, yeah,
Messy,
messy,
complicated.
messy, complicated, like life.
Exactly. So I know I just asked the question, but I'm going to tweak our next question a little bit because we did already kind of got into discussing which of the relationships are the healthiest. Not saying that it is the healthiest, but out of comparison. So discussing Willow and Oz, what would you say in the relationship are examples of a healthy or like components of their relationship that are, healthy?
I mean, there seems to be a lot of mutual respect and admiration in that relationship. And like that's the place that it's starting from. I think it's such an iconic moment when Oz, I can't remember, is it in the same episode? Is it in the Halloween episode where he clocks Willow like twice and he's like, who is that girl?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think it starts from a place of respect, and I think their communication is actually always pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And contrary to Oz's very smooth, cool, like exterior, he's actually really good with the emotions. He's I think he does a pretty good job of communicating it when he needs to
Mm-hmm.
Willow and vice versa. And I mean, both people have to feel that it's safe to do that, that it's safe to communicate things that that the other person might not like hearing. And I think all of that just kind of really adds up for me with Willow and Oz.
Yeah, that moment when they first like when they're when they go for Buffy's birthday and they go to steal the rocket launcher, and she's like, "Hey, do you want to make out?" And so perceptively, and again, like he sees the situation, he analyzes and go, "Hey, from an outsider's perspective, this looks like what's going on. That's not what I want. What I want is you." And when I look at
Yeah.
you, it's like Willow, freeze frame. And it's like, that's what I want. And it's like, not only were you like, hey, let's not get into a messy situation, but the real situation is this. And it's about you and me and not about anybody else. And like, that's when I was like, it's everything. Like, that's everything that you want is that someone is like, I'm not thinking about anybody else except you and me right now in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And bless Seth Green for the way that he delivers that dialogue too.
Yeah.
So good.
But he's so perceptive, and even in the episode where Willow, is it phases, the one where she tries to like seduce him and puts on some Barry White.
Yeah, was that the one in season 3 where she was trying to make up for it after her?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm conflating two episodes.
No, we do it all the time. Don't worry.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
that's it. And he's like, again, he comes in being so perceptive, like,
Yeah.
you don't have to make this up to me. Like, I want this to happen for us. I want it to be about the two of us and not about things that have happened with other people.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite Oz moments.
Yeah.
So now the thing that I have just now in this moment gotten so angry about based on our previous conversation. So you can write a character, you can write a male character that is so perceptive and so like intuitive to what is going on, and you've also written this person who is your insert, and this is the person. So like that, to me, that just makes it even more frustrating because it's not that is you're not capable of acknowledging those things, it's you're refusing to acknowledge those things within yourself. Sorry, that just made me. I just kind of.
No, that's fair. And I wonder if part of that too is like we don't exactly know when Joss was stepping in and doctoring, having his
True.
say in scripts. But I mean, I think it's pretty well known that he did a lot of that. I mean, he
Yeah.
really had a hand in that. And there's a fantastic team of writers working on Buffy.
Right.
And so I want to think that we're talking about like, the few female writers in the room who are writing this wonderfully nuanced male
Yeah,
character.
that's true too. Yeah.
Like I want to thank Marty Noxon and Jane Espenson for that. Although I don't
Shout
know.
out.
Although I don't know. But to your point, Charles, I wonder if part of that is just being like insistent on no, this is what we're doing with the Xander character,
Right. And maybe having that dichotomy of those two types of boys was important to be like, these are the two, So, ugh.
Yeah.
I like that question, Kate. That was a good question.
Thanks.
Yeah, that is a good question. The one thing that kind of hits for me being out of character for Oz is when the Veruca storyline. Like that, I mean, heartbreaking anytime Allison Hannigan cries. But that just the way that Oz handles it, like I think we all know that Seth Green wanted to step away from the show, and so they had to write him off, which makes sense. He wanted to go and do other things, but I think the way that they deal with Oz navigating that just seems out of character for him. What do y'all think?
It's a good question. I don't know that we have yet discussed that perspective on.
I think maybe Kate, you and I have talked about this offline or something.
Yeah.
But I think like for me, him leaving, I get, and him having to go do all that. The thing that I actually dislike and where I do think they do a huge disservice and they do a total character assassination of who Oz is when he comes back and Willow is dating Tara. And there's that moment where he is talking he runs into Tara in the hallway and he's like, oh, hey, and she knows who he is, but he doesn't know who she is. And they have this moment and he's like, wait, you've been with her. I can smell
like her.
all.
Yeah.
You smell like her. And then he just flips out and then like wolfs out and goes. And it's like, you have spent this entire time like zenning out so that you can do this. And the fact that Willow smells like someone like it makes zero sense. And he goes from 0 to Wolfman in like 3 seconds. And it doesn't make sense for Oz as a character as before he went away. Like that would not have been a reaction he would have had before. I mean, we saw that because we saw what happened when we saw Willow and Xander making out. He didn't freak out like that. Like that was a moment to put Tara in danger and to make Oz the bad guy and to like heighten the stakes, but it was completely out of character for him.
Yeah, and it was also to feed the Riley storyline of deciding to, go against, enact court-martial behavior or, behavior that could be court-martialed.
Yeah.
So that he makes the decision to like betray the initiative.
Right.
Why didn't you want me to talk about Riley and Buffy? You didn't want me to talk about that relationship?
I mean,
because we don't really like it. We think he's boring, and we thought he had more chemistry with Willow. That's basically
right. Exactly.
I mean, we can definitely delve into.
If
Buffy
you
and
have
Riley.
things to say about it, please do. But
I don't hate Riley as much as other people do. I like mostly feel bad for him. And I also think Mark Blucas is a really cool person and feel bad that he gets shit on so much by fans. But now he lives on a farm and like seems to have a pretty good life. So I'm happy for him.
Yeah. We don't hate Mark. We are definitely not like Mark Lucas haters or Riley haters, but you know.
No,
it's boring.
He was just put in a rough situation.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mark, if you're listening, come on anytime.
Yeah.
I also feel like it was like trying to make fetch happen. Like they were trying to make them like the next big couple. And you're like, dude, it's just not working. It's no offense to the actors. It's no offense to the show, but like it ain't working. They should have ended at the season 4. He should have gone off to do something else with the military and realized this relationship was not going to work beyond that. And then she gets to be alone for a while, that would have been way more interesting season 5.
Buffy gets to do some soul searching and maybe some therapy, question mark.
Right? She'd have more time for that than Riley.
I think every Buffy fan has been like, can the girl get some therapy, please? Can she just sit, other than that one session that she had and her therapist was murdered.
Right.
The school counselor. And I loved their relationship for the one episode. I thought it was so great. They had great chemistry. I was like, that would have been so awesome to have her do multiple sessions with him over season 3. I was like, that would have been awesome. But that's one thing, like you go back now watching the show and you realize like how much television writing and storytelling has grown since the Buffy days. And I think it's inspired by Buffy and it's driven by what Buffy did. But you're like, wow, we've matured so much. Like that story would be told so differently. Like she would go to therapy. It might not work, but she would end up at the school counselor or whatever. It would just be told in such a different way, I think, nowadays.
What if you could like combine The Sopranos with Buffy? And where like Buffy's going to therapy, but also just fighting all of these demons all the
time. If the risk of death weren't so high, I would love to be Buffy's therapist.
I know, right? It'd be like becoming the magic box owner.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, I think that's a really good point. I am so thankful that mental health in pop culture has evolved. Now we have shows like Heartstopper, which I don't know if either of you have watched it or are familiar with the story.
It's delightful. It's a lovely, delightful, queer love story.
Oh yeah. I personally find it to be just so sweet, and there's something so healing to see these kinds of stories being told now that they weren't even allowed to. I think you had a previous conversation where Willow wasn't allowed to be bi. She that was too confusing for viewers. That's too how can people really understand being attracted to more than one gender? But now we have stories that are being told where therapy is actually a big part of the story, and it's also not this terrible traumatic experience. And there wasn't space for that in Buffy, like in the 90s and early aughts.
Well, it seems like that's the thing that made the conflict, and we've talked about this before about like the trauma is drama sort of like trope or whatever, and doing all of that. And now when I look at TV shows and I watch shows, like there's conflict, sure, absolutely, because there's always conflict in life, but conflict arises naturally and can resolve naturally. But like some of the contrived ways in which they do it, I'm always just screaming now at my TV going, why don't you just say something? Like it doesn't make any sense why you would just not answer the question and like move on. Like there are better ways to make conflict in the situation than you being like, I'm going to hold the most important thing and not tell anybody.
It's definitely a pet peeve of mine. Definitely not me shouting at the characters in books. Why don't you just tell them what you're thinking?
I know, it's so true. It's like one of the reasons I can't watch melodrama. I'm like, oh, that is like the epitome of like artificially constructed barriers in like particularly relationships. And you're like, this is ridiculous. Just talk to each other. Stop keeping secrets.
And yet people still do it in real life all the time.
True. But it always feels like, I don't know, sometimes there's certain things like shows do well in translating and there are other things they don't. And some of those artificial barriers where like real life may be stranger than fiction, but I don't know, sometimes it still doesn't come across well in fiction,
Right.
or it doesn't come across believable, maybe is the better way of saying it.
Yeah.
Even if crazier things could happen in real life, you're like, I still gotta believe it if I'm gonna suspend, disbelief.
It's true. So we've talked about like all of these healthy relationships and what that looks like, which I think is really important because we should be focusing on that. But I also think it's important to like identify like sort of toxic relationships and what those look like. And this question, so Jenna, do you think a toxic relationship can become a healthy relationship? If you're in a toxic relationship with someone, let's say, for instance, Spike and Buffy, which is clearly a toxic relationship, do you think if they had the time and the space to work on that, could that have become a healthy relationship?
I mean, I think if we took the sexual assault piece out of it,
Sure.
Mhm.
You're
that's
taking
like,
out the thing red.
yeah, that's for me a hard stop.
Hmm.
That no, like when there's sexual violence involved, get do what you can to get out. But I think if we're kind of putting that aside, I think there's a world in which Buffy and Spike. Now, I don't want it to sound like I'm just suggesting therapy as the solution for every single thing, but they go to therapy and they.
But isn't therapy
And
really the solution to everything?
well, I think so.
I have found it incredibly helpful. It's been a solution to a lot of my problems.
I mean, I have found it to be incredibly helpful too. I do my own therapy. I think it's really important for people working in mental health to do it. Um, but back to Buffy and Spike, I do think that people can work through stuff to just show up differently with one another. That it's not again like a diagnosis that this is a toxic relationship and there's nothing that we can do to change that. The caveat sort of being that both people have to be willing to change because if one person is trying to change the way that they are showing up with another person and their partner is not budging, then the pattern and the way that these two people are engaged with one another is not going to change. It can't. Like that's how systems work.
Right.
If one thing in a closed system changes, something else has to change.
What do you think of where they took their relationship in season 7? I mean, especially coming out of the sexual assault or the attempted sexual assault.
Yeah.
I know that it's a
It's
messy
a hard question.
yeah.
I'm trying to think about it. I mean, personally, I have a soft spot for Buffy and Spike in season 7 because it's not my favorite season. I think there's just a lot of messiness. Like there's some good things happening, but story wise, I don't think it's super tight. They are kind of like this constant for one another in a season that is pretty I mean, not dark compared to season 6, I guess, but
Mhm.
like you're talking about the really the end of the world, but for real this time.
Mhm.
Right.
This is not just some normal apocalypse.
Right.
And they it's almost like it's a different relationship in season 7 with
Mhm.
Spike and Buffy than it is elsewhere in the show. So it's like I wonder if that's what the relationship could have looked like without the dynamic of season 6 and
Mhm.
without the attempted rape.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like if seeing Red had never happened, if we could remove that moment, then I do think that Buffy and Spike could have found. I'm not saying that they would have been in game necessarily, but they could have found like a love for each other that was like she could have found like a more mature love, an actual real love that was like I I'm choosing you based on who you are as a person and not necessarily based on, you know, this teenage angsty love or, all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
Jenna, did you ever read the season 8 through season 12 comics that were supposed to be basically like continuation of the show?
I never did. No, I haven't read any of the comics.
So, so it's a running joke that I don't consider it canon because I only consider things I like canon. That being said, there are actually a couple of seasons I do like. In particular, I believe it's season 10 and 11. And in those seasons, they actually do get Spike and Buffy back together. And the reason I like it, and part of the reason I don't like the comics, I think in those early seasons, it's like they knew the formula for high school worked, and it feels like they tried to drag them back there without actually being in high school. They just kept repeating like the patterns and the behavior. And I'm like, they're like 23, 24 now because some time has passed, I think, when season 8 starts. I'm like, no, they're behaving like they're 16. I was like, no. So that's partly why I don't really like it. Just felt like very regressive and where they had all kind of ended up at the end of season 7. And so anyway, they do get together, but what I loved about it is they actually have conversations. They talk about their past, they talk about their issues and and they talk, I believe if it's been a while since I read it, but I believe they even talk about the attempted assault. And it's like, yes, I'm not even saying like if they didn't end up staying together, fine. But it was such a like first time I felt like any sort of healthy behavior between any of the characters had actually happened. It felt refreshing.
Yeah, that does sound refreshing, actually talking to each
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
about what's going on.
Right. Right.
That
And like admitting to each other, that, the things that they do in order to like lack of communication or whatever their like, their habits were. And I just was like, oh, this is what this addition like continuing series should be all the time.
that and that's an interesting that's such a I have not read those seasons. I
Yeah.
It makes me want to go back and read it because then it just brings up a question in general, like would you, should you, could you maintain a healthy relationship with someone who has committed sexual assault against you?
Yeah, I mean
Or does it, I mean, I guess it's different from everyone, I guess.
it
That's
it is. I think not to I don't want this to sound like an excuse, and I think we've actually talked about this in previous episodes. I do think sometimes some of these moral ethical dilemmas in the way characters treat each other are hard to dissect and make, real world analogies because there is the supernatural element. So
right.
there's
Yeah.
like elements of it that couldn't happen in the real world. So it's like, how do you make that comparison? Like, or how
R-
can you pull that into anything that's like relatable? So I do feel that way again, not to justify Spike's behavior, but I do feel that way about what happens in the bathroom and between them and seeing red. It's messier than like a not that real life sexual assault and rape isn't messy, but does that I feel like I'm overcomplicating the thing, but it takes it to a different level that some of the things you can't pull out because it just doesn't exist in the real world.
Right, right. Yeah. Because like Jenna was saying, like the end of the world is coming.
Right,
The
exactly.
literal real
Right,
end of the world is coming. And
right,
so I need your help. And
right.
so
And if nothing, at the end of the day, Buffy's pragmatic and she's about the mission, as they show in season 7.
yeah.
And,
And speeches.
and speeches.
And speeches, yes. The
And I
mission
think
and speeches.
yeah. And Buffy realizes like Spike went and made a big change. He didn't come back to her not having changed. And so
True.
like I think that's the thing that like, that she really fights with Giles about in that season of him not understanding that I need everyone in this fight. Like this is the fight of all fights.
The fight of my life, yeah.
Fight of my life. He's changed. He's got the, strength and ability that I need. He can help protect these Slayers in training, and he can help me fight. And I got to do what I got to do to get through this.
And he's holding himself accountable
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
everything that he never sort of stops atoning for the fact that I did this. I know I did it, and I will keep reminding you that I know that I did this thing.
Yeah. Kate, I think you're definitely onto something about it being hard with the supernatural element, that it is really hard to tease out these sort of moral dilemmas. I'm thinking about even just other supernatural shows, like I'm thinking about like the Vampire Diaries, where so much of the behavior is terrible, and you're like, but they're vampires, so actually it's not that bad.
They could be worse.
Right. And it does make it really hard to parallel relationships in the real world.
Yeah.
Without the supernatural element, because like Spike isn't just accepting responsibility. He also came back, he got a soul.
Right.
And now is reliving the pain that he's inflicted on others every day.
Yeah. I mean, that being said, we said this before too in previous episodes. It's not like we don't understand, people who are like, I can't understand why Buffy and Spike had any connection coming into season 7 and where they ended up. Again, multiple truths can be true at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. A piece of information that I find really interesting in interviews, James Marsters has mentioned that filming those scenes really, really, really fucked with his head. And,
yeah.
I mean, led him to do really to therapy again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because therapy's great.
Because he said he didn't want to do this. Like initially, I don't think he even wanted to do that scene. He was like,
yeah.
Let's not. Can we not? Please.
Yes.
Right. Which also to me shows you how much, I mean, again, not saying there's still issues behind the scenes of the film and TV industry, but probably how much has changed where you now have intimacy coordinators and there'd be a conversation about this, and maybe they would change the storyline if the actor was like, I can't, this is going to impact my mental health. Like we have to do something different, or we have to make him do something to hurt her in a different way that still drive the storyline and get him to get the soul. So again, even like behind the scenes, so much has changed in the last 25, 30 years.
Yeah, because there's so many times. So when I had done another podcast that was during the pandemic, and I was interviewing Mackenzie Aston, who was on The Magicians, and he played like a trickster god who has a rape scene with one of the characters on there. And she was like, when they were filming that scene, when he was playing Reynard and it was filming that scene, the actress, I can't think of her name right now, who plays Julia, she'd like, they're like in between takes, and she was like, you're not enjoying it enough. Like you are not, you have to like really enjoy this for this to play well. And so like the idea that you have to like get into the headspace of kind of like enjoying hurting someone else for your own pleasure just feels like such a bad, like not a healthy thing for any actor to have to go through, whether you're, the receiver or the giver of that violence. It feels very so there's a lot of discussion, and so a lot of changes have been made with intimacy coordinators, and we use them now all the time. Even in our theater productions, we have one on almost every show now.
Yeah. Sorry, I almost interrupted you, Charles, because I got really excited because I also really like The Magicians. And
I love it. It's great.
Yeah, it blows my mind that this is just something that people didn't have for so long, like just filming all sorts of sex scenes, scenes with sexual assault without any sort of conversations happening before, after. Because, I mean, I know not all actors work the same way and people have their own processes, but you do have to get into the mind of the character. Like, I've heard actors in talk about playing villains, they don't think of themselves as the villain. They're not playing it as though they're the villain. They're playing it as though this is just like their perspective and their experience, and they believe in everything that they're doing. And so to be asked to film those kinds of scenes without any sort of support, no wonder it messed with James' head having to film this.
Yeah, and like that consent level, and that even that consent of like, can I hold your hand? Like, because maybe someone's not comfortable with that. Like, that is a moment of intimacy of just even holding hands, or like putting your hands on someone's body. Like, you are now in my space. Like, what is going, like, where is it okay for you to touch me? Like, where is that green space? Where is that red space? Where's today you can, but maybe tomorrow you can't because I feel differently about myself and where I am. So Jenna, we've been talking about a lot of heavy issues. As we do. We've laughed, we've cried. It's better than Cats. Where
Oh my God. Anything is better than Cats.
anything.
Sorry, Cats.
So Jenna, where like in all of these conversations, we're talking about therapy, we're talking about like healthy relationships, toxic relationships, all of these things. What are some resources that what are good resources where people can go to like get more information about these things, or if they want to explore some of these things on their own time? Because we like to offer our listeners a little extra something. We don't want to leave them. We don't want to leave them hanging. We don't want to traumatize them with all of our conversations and then be like, "Good luck."
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, for anyone who is in a relationship that they're starting to question or feeling unsafe, or if there's any element of abuse or assault happening, there are resources. One of them is RAIN, and they have a national sexual assault hotline, which is free and confidential 24/7. So you can go to their website, rainn.org, rain.org. There's also, there's a lot of resources out there. There's books if you want to read more about building healthy relationships and attachment. And I have a couple of recommendations for folks that have been suggested by other therapists I know. One of them is a book called Attached: The New Science of Adult Attachment and How It Can Help You Find and Keep Love. And the co-authors of that are Amir Levine and Rachel S.F. Heller. And there's 2 other books written by a guy named Stan Tatkin. One of them is called Wired for Dating. And it's how understanding neurobiology and attachment style can help you find your ideal mate. And then he has another book called Wired for Love, how understanding your partner's brain and attachment style can help you diffuse conflict and build a secure relationship. And again, that author's name is Stan Tatkin, Tatkin. And I'm happy to share, links if you want for show notes. But if you're unsure about the relationship that you're in, and honestly, my best advice would just be to reach out to someone that you trust, whether that's a neighbor or a friend or healthcare provider, and they can help get you somewhere safe. And yeah, so those would be the couple of resources that I would suggest for folks.
Oh, thank you. We will definitely put those in the show notes because unlike some other podcasts, we actually put these things in our show notes. I'm not dogging on any other podcasts. I really not. I love all podcasts. Yes, all podcasts. We do put stuff in our show notes, so those are there. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your love of Buffy and your knowledge and your insights. It's been really great. It's given me some new perspectives for sure.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been so fun. It's actually been a dream of mine to talk about Buffy on a podcast. Maybe that seems small to people, but
Hey, that's been our dream. So.
Making dreams come true.
We love it.
That's why we
love
it.
Yes, thank you so much. It was so great having you on and getting your perspective, from a therapist and social worker's perspective on the show and these characters and their romantic relationships.
Well, it's been a delight to be here with both of you.
And if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to either let us know or learn more, you can email us at abuffypodcast@gmail.com, or you can follow us on social media. We are on Instagram and Facebook at A Buffy Podcast. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.